In 1941, a motley dressed group of Americans sailed across the Pacific. They looked innocent enough, trying to keep themselves occupied on the long voyage. Their documents said they were plantation owners, teachers, businessmen, even missionaries. Few who saw this ragtag group would have guessed that they would soon become one of the most famous military units in history. The American volunteer group entered the war through the back door. Literally. By the time they arrived in Asia, Japan controlled all of China's ports. So they traveled to Rangoon, Burma. In 1941, Burma was still a British colony. It was a convenient place for the Tigers to set up shop. They arrived without fanfare. As a private air force skirting neutrality laws, they deliberately kept a low profile. Contracted by the Chinese government, the AVG was recruited by and under the command of General Claire Chennault. They initially moved inland and set up base deep inside Burma. It was not what the young American airmen looking for adventure had in mind. Living conditions were difficult. Heat was a problem, as were the insects. When eating, the airmen used two plates, one with the food and the other to cover it. When sleeping, they had nets to protect them from mosquitoes, but they couldn't protect them from the rats that fell from the ceiling. Chennault had his own idea of how to run an air force. Being a clandestine unit, they had no uniforms. To build esprit de corps, he did away with unnecessary regulations. He even abolished saluting. Chennault valued results. He didn't care how they were achieved.
But you know, Mitch, that's one of the reasons he got in trouble, because he didn't act like the formal military. His men wore what they wanted to wear. They said one time Tex Hill went up in an airplane in his underwear and cowboy boots.
A U.S. Army general described them as the worst troops I have ever seen. The British based near Rangoon simply called them rogues. But military men were distracted by the AVG's outward appearance. The lack of discipline had no effect on their courage. Their critics ignored that the AVG were civilians, not soldiers. When the shooting started, they proved they were worth more than proper soldiers. The AVG's success stemmed from Chennault's superior tactics and training. He didn't care much for parade ground routine. He spent all his time teaching his airmen how to knock the Japanese out of the sky. Chennault developed a rigorous training program and enforced rigid flight discipline. He taught them his radical tactics for air battle survival. It was based on information about the Japanese Air Force that he collected himself. Chennault's tactics went against everything they had been taught in military flying schools. Pilots under Chennault's command were not allowed to dogfight. They were taught to hit and dive.
So he's seeing the Russians and how they do against the Japanese. What Chennault learned was basically to take the strongest points of American-built aircraft and use them against the weakest points of the Japanese aircraft. So the one thing the American airplanes had was weight and firepower. And the P-40 was one of the fastest diving propeller-driven airplanes of World War II, where they would come in with tremendous speed, with tremendous firepower. Japanese airplanes were not armored. That was one reason for their remarkable maneuverability. So you didn't have to hit them many times. They would, if you hit them with a 50 caliber gun, they would fall apart, basically. The important thing was always altitude, height. You have height, you live. You don't have height, you die. Chennault took this to the basic tenet of his air combat training. Stay above the Japanese, attack when you were ready to attack, do a very fast dive by beyond 500 miles an hour. Then you have what's called a zoom recovery. Your momentum from that tremendous speed helps you regain your altitude. Come back again. Do not engage the Japanese in aerial combat. If they want to fight, go away.
The P-40 was the same speed of the Japanese airplane, actually in open, but the P-40 could dive faster than any plane there was. So the effectiveness of this dive and hit became the part of the thing.
The AVG ace Tex Hill once said, "Chennault's tactical lesson was impressive. He taught us how to fight and made us believe that he knew how to deal with the Japanese planes." Contrary to conventional battle theory, Chennault taught his pilots to avoid engaging in dogfights, which the more maneuverable Japanese planes were sure to win. The unconventional hit-and-run tactic was based on Chennault's years of experience. It became the secret of their success.
Most of his pilots were not fighter pilots, so he had to start from the basics. They tend to land an airplane hard. So there were many crashes in training in Burma. Several pilots were killed in training accidents. You know, a little blood you give in training saves a lot of blood in combat. Once the fighting began, and once they actually had met the Japanese, thank God they had listened to him, because he told them exactly right.
Training under Chennault was rigorous, both on the ground and in the air. But after the training, Chennault was very easygoing as a standard Southern gentleman.
He didn't care. They called him the old man, you know, not always to his face, but I think occasionally. And they said on the baseball field when he played baseball with them that, you know, he pitched and they would holler at him about pitching or umpiring or whatever he did, like they did anybody else on the team. But, you know, they never really made that special place. He treated them as equals, not as being their superiors.
The tough-looking old man used to say that his office door was always open. The AVG went to China with 100 planes. So many were damaged during the training that when combat began in 1941, just 43 planes were airworthy. They were spread between 3 squadrons: Adam and Eve, Panda Bears, and Hell's Angels. Although each squadron had its own emblem, their planes all shared one distinctive feature: a large shark mouth in the front of each aircraft.
The shark's mouth looks like it came out of the factory that way. It just looked right. It covered that radiator. It made it look sexy. Now, the interesting thing is, if you talk to fighter pilots who flew the entire family of P-40s in China, they didn't call them P-40s, they called them sharks.
The AVG did not originate the design. German and Australian squadrons painted the shark mouth on their planes first. One of Chennault's pilots saw a shark-mouthed Australian P-40 in a magazine and decided to paint his own. Chenault loved the idea. Soon enough, every P-40 had a menacing shark mouth. With the pilot's training complete, and with the plane's war paint on, the AVG was ready to go to war. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor broke the last shackle holding the AVG back. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet's main base, Pearl Harbor. Eighteen warships were sunk, 188 aircraft were destroyed, and over 2,000 people were killed. In a speech to the nation, President Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
The sneak attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. Isolationist voices were silenced, and America went to war. While Roosevelt raged against the Japanese attack, the reaction of Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek was decidedly different.
He sang a Chinese opera aria to the whole staff. It was as if he was floating. Now America was in the war, no limits to Lend-Lease. And he said, you know, there'll be fighter planes, there'll be weapons, there'll be money.
Even old leather-faced Chennault was reckoned to have cracked a smile at the news. The Allies quickly established the China-Burma-India Theater. Chiang was named as Supreme Allied Commander in China. In his diary, Chiang Kai-shek confessed that he was flattered by his appointment. Now China enjoys unprecedented high reputation and status. I fear the undeserved title. Chennault and his men learned the news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in the hot and humid jungle backwater of Burma. Much closer to the Japanese than any other U.S. Air Force units, they realized that they were now in the front line of the war.
We're training in Burma, and what happened, I was standing on a P-40 one day, and a fellow from the radio shack came out and he said, "Joe, they just bombed Pearl Harbor." So I said, "You're kidding?" He said, "No." So right away we dispersed all of our airplanes around the field, and we were on alert from then on.
Chennault told his men that from then on, they didn't have to battle in secret, and that the AVG were now not just fighting for China, but also for America. Chennault had to split his meager force. One squadron stayed to protect Rangoon. The other two squadrons moved to Kunming, China. The other two squadrons moved to Kunming, China on December 18th. So did Chennault's headquarters.
It was pretty much of a mess. They'd been in war so long that a lot of the towns had been bombed out or bombed. And all I know is that the AVG, wherever we went, we got the best food there was and the best treatment from the Chinese.
Yunlong, governor of Yunnan province, provided his private residence for Chenault. The quarters for the airmen were in Kunha Normal School, with facilities including tennis courts, a library, and a shooting range. Each pilot had his own room. The Chongqing government even set up a service group to do laundry, cooking, and other chores.
They treated us with the best they could. They used to make cookies in for us, come and bring cookies. They took care of us like their own, or better than their own.
With its pleasant climate, comfortable living conditions, and a standard American food, Kunming brought relief from the swarms of mosquitoes and primitive living conditions at the Burma base. The move to Kunming was not without mishap. 3 planes crashed on the journey. One pilot who crash-landed had a narrow escape. The language barrier almost cost him his life. Mistaking anyone who flew as Japanese, he was captured by locals. He was lucky not to be killed on the spot. Thereafter, a piece of silk stamped with the Chinese flag was sewn on every AVG flight jacket with the words, "This foreign person has come to China to help in the war effort. Soldiers and civilians, one and all, should rescue, protect, and provide him with medical care." The AVG called it their blood chit. It saved the lives of countless American pilots shot down during the war.
同一天，在他们到达昆明降落前，日本人就对昆明来了一次轰炸。那志愿队的人，他们那时候刚好到了他们一到昆明就到市区去看那些情景，他们就看到一堆断垣残壁，一堆中国人被炸的，那个四肢都飞到电线杆上去，或肠子跑出来。那美国人看到是很受不了，他们就看到之后，他们就下定决心，一定要在第2天的空战中给日本人好看。
At last, it was time to put their training to the test. In the morning of December 20th, 10 Japanese bombers attacked Kunming. They thought the city was defenseless. Chenault ordered 24 aircraft to take off. He had staked his career on this moment. Up till then, the Japanese had been invincible in the air. Neither the Chinese, the American, nor the British Air Forces had been able to stop them. Would Chenault's motley crew be able to deliver on his promise to wipe the Japanese from the air?
We got up to altitude. We knew that we were above the Japanese bombers. Pretty soon there's a formation of 10 Japanese planes. We'd never seen a Japanese plane in the air. And here they came. We knew we had them.
The AVG dived and launched their attack on the Japanese aircraft, just as Chenault had taught them.
When I pressed the trigger, no guns. And I thought, oh, and I've used a lot of 4-letter words, but I pulled off immediately. I was so excited that I had turned it off and on so many times I left it off. Then I immediately turned it back on, of course, and got back in combat. And we just hit them from all directions.
6 Japanese were shot down. 3 were heavily damaged. Only 1 escaped. Just 1 AVG fighter was slightly damaged. Chenault got the result he promised, but he remained impassive when debriefing the returned pilots. He praised them for their success, but pointed out their weaknesses exposed during the battle. He exhorted them to do even better the next time. Chennault may not have been satisfied with the victory, but others were. Many local civilians watched the air battle in awe. It was the first time they had seen Japanese planes bested. People in Kunming were elated. Some carried Japanese wreckage in triumph. Others celebrated the victory in more conventional ways.
They're happy, you know, they would wave at you, and you could see the difference, the smiles on their face, you know.
这大概是日本零式战斗机出现之后，首次中国空军在空中第一次击退日本的飞机，取得大胜。那昆明人民的士气就大振，因为他们觉得说，终于我们有人来保护我们了。所以志愿队在从那个时候开始，他们就被视为英雄看待。
对昆明老百姓而言，这是个相当重大的一个战果，可以免除被轰炸。
The AVG had even greater success defending Rangoon. From the end of 1941, the Japanese fiercely bombed Rangoon. In the severely damaged city, the Rangoon Great Golden Stupa was the only landmark that survived the bombing. Covered in gold, the 1,000-year-old building was the oldest and most expensive stupa in the world. Perhaps because Burma and Japan are both Buddhist countries, merciful Japanese pilots allowed the building to survive. In wartime, it was the safest place in Rangoon. However, the Rangoon Great Golden Stupa couldn't protect the rest of the city. On December 23rd, 48 Japanese bombers and 20 fighter escorts attacked Rangoon. They were intercepted by the 3rd Squadron of the AVG.
And I picked up on a bomber that was off to one side a little bit from the main formation and opened up at about maybe 200 yards and bored in directly astern. And saw flashes all over the place, and the next thing I know, the damn thing blew up in front of me, and I was blown up like a leaf. And I remember the greatest feeling of glee that I guess I've ever felt at knowing that I had blown this guy out of the sky.
"12 Japanese aircraft were shot down. The AVG lost 2 planes and 2 pilots. "22-year-old wingman Henry Gilbert was the first AVG pilot killed in battle. Recruited soon after his marriage, his wife was then 6 months pregnant. Chennault wrote to her of her husband's death.
There are letters that he's written home that said losing them is like losing one of his own children. They were some of the best pilots that he had ever been around in his life, and he'd been around many and he had taught many. And so to lose one of them, he said, was like losing one of his own. And I think it hurt him deeply every time they didn't come home.
Gilbert's death made it personal. The AVG wasn't just fighting for China. They wanted revenge for themselves. On December 25th, the Japanese sent a massive fleet to bomb Rangoon and to wipe out its air defenses. They were met by a combined force of 12 AGV P-40s and 16 RAF fighters.
On Christmas Day, 1941, this was the big day. The Japanese said they're coming over with a lot of Christmas gifts for us. They came over with about 100 fighters and bombers. And on that day, we destroyed 25, I think, or 24 Japanese airplanes without a single loss.
Each of us got a couple of bombers. They were dropping like flies. They were rolling out of the formation, wings coming off, blowing up. It was a scene of like something out of hell.
The AVG lost 2 planes, but no pilots were injured. The Japanese gave the Americans a present, all right, just not the one they intended. The result was a huge gift to China and its allies.
They lost most of their pilots in that raid, you know. They said they lost the best 2 fighter pilots they had in that raid.
But even victory costs. The AVG was rapidly running out of planes. Because of the scarcity of spare parts, there were at most 20 aircraft available for each combat.
And props and tires, you just couldn't get. That's all. We tried to get them from the Philippines, you know, when the Philippines folded up, but then it was difficult to get them in there.
The 20 serviceable AVG planes were severely outnumbered by over 300 Japanese aircraft. Critically, the AVG lost pilots as well as planes. Robert Sandrell, the flight leader of the 1st Squadron, was the first leader killed in action. Before he died, he had already got 5 planes. Each AVG squadron suffered casualties in the battle. The losses were crucial. Planes and pilots were irreplaceable. "44-year-old Louis Hoffman was the oldest AVG pilot. During the combat in Rangoon, he grappled with 5 Japanese aircraft before he was killed. He was one of the few AVGs who was married and had children. He once said the reason he chose to come to China was because he was able to fight. He felt happy and worthy. So did the young and fearless airman.
We, as young, adventurous, dedicated boys, we did the best we could with what we had, and they didn't give up. We didn't give up.
At the end of 1941 and early 1942, the legend of the American volunteer group spread rapidly. At the start of the Pacific War, the Japanese appeared invincible. The Allies were losing the war and were hungry for a victory. That a small air unit won a series of battles surprised the whole world. The AVG became famous and got a new nickname.
首先呢，重庆的报纸啊，是看什么呢？它这个飞机啊，如虎添翼啊，在天上，如虎添翼，咱们一个意思的报道的。就这个如虎添翼，这个飞是像这个还是飞天空的符了嘛。
Chinese press had dubbed us flying tigers. And so when our little cavalcades went through town on the way from our hostel to the airfield or whatever, these people would all cheer and they were all very happy with us. And of course, we were happy to be greeted that way.
The American media quickly picked up on the name. Soon everyone was talking about the Flying Tigers. The Walt Disney Company even designed an insignia for them, a winged tiger flying through a large V for victory. In February 1942, Generalissimo and Madame Chang came to Kunming in person. They gave a banquet for AVG members in the #1 AVG hostel. During the dinner, Chang spoke highly of the AVG. With its record of 1 against 30 Japanese, the American Volunteer Group was the bravest air unit of all. Madame Chang called them her angels. Madame Chiang Kai-shek enchanted not only Chenault, but also the pilots. In a letter home, John Donovan wrote, "She looked vivacious, attractive, energetic, with a much more striking personality than most any other woman I have ever seen. We cheered her to the rafters time and again." During the banquet, Madame Chang earned the respect and admiration of all. Madame Chang expressed her willingness to be the unit's honorary commander and the conduit between the AVG and Shanghai Shek. Later, on behalf of the Chinese Cultural Society, she presented a painting of an eagle as a gift for the AVG. In these, the darkest days of war with Japan, the AVG had become the symbol of victory. China was physically isolated. With Japan controlling China's ports, the only way to get supplies to China was overland. The Burma Road, constructed right after the Japanese invasion, was the most important access to international support. It was entirely built by people in Yunnan, under the most trying conditions, and usually only with hand tools. In less than 10 months, from November 1937 to September 1938, people in Yunnan constructed the road with their own hands through the mountains and valleys. It was 1,153 kilometers long, from Lashio to Kunming. More than 200,000 laborers, including a large number of ethnic minorities, the elderly, even women carrying babies and children, worked on the road. In that period, as many as 2,300 people died building the road. The Burma Road was China's crucial link to aid and materials from the outside world. It was the only link China was able to hold until America entered the war. More than 4 times as much vital war material came via the road than on all other ways into China combined. In early 1942, the Tigers were fighting a war on 2 fronts. The Tigers helped secure both ends of the vital Burma Road by keeping the skies clear over both Kunming and Rangoon. In northern Burma, Chenault faced a very grim situation. While Japan had 400 to 500 aircraft available for combat there, the combined force of the AVG and the RAF was down to just 30 fighters and a handful of bombers. Facing such numerical superiority, Chenault ordered his Flying Tigers to avoid direct engagement with the enemy. Instead, they applied guerrilla tactics. In late March, Chenault launched the Chiang Mai Raid. They destroyed about 20 Japanese aircraft. However, in this operation, John Newkirk, the 2nd Squadron leader, was killed by gunfire. By the time he died, he was a double ace, having destroyed 10 enemy aircraft. On March 25, 1942, the New York Times featured Newkirk's death with his photo. The Japanese were furious at Chennault's guerrilla tactics. They used the radio to threaten the Flying Tigers, saying they would be shown no mercy if they continued using guerrilla tactics. Baptized by fire over the Burma sky, the volunteers were no longer babies.
When they went down to Rangoon and fought in Rangoon, and when they came back, they had aged 10 years. If I had seen that in a film, I wouldn't have believed it. I would have thought it was an exaggeration on the director's part. They were men when they came back. They just turned into men overnight.
Yet in the end, the air defense of Burma was futile. Japan's infantry overwhelmed the Allied ground troops and forced Britain to abandon Burma. The Flying Tigers regrouped in China. They soon faced their biggest ever challenge. Ironically, it wasn't against planes, but against Japanese ground troops. The Battle of the Salween Gorge was a turning point in the war. The Salween, or Nu, River is the boundary between China and Burma. The steep river gorge is a natural moat protecting China's southwest flank. In May 1942, it was the only thing that stood between China and the massive Japanese army in Burma. On May 5th, the Japanese were shocked to find a Japanese division attempting to cross the river.
那陈纳德收到命令，必须在大批部队没赶到怒江对峙之前呢，必须把这些人阻挡在怒江里面。所以他派了飞机去炸。
Fortunately, Chennault had received 6 new model P-40s. They were equipped to carry bombs under their wings. But the AVG had to make the bombs themselves.
We were working on a gasoline bomb too, you know. Fill the thing with gasoline and put some kind of a detonator on it. And we were trying to make anything we could to use, you know, to bomb them. We bombed them. We found these big old bombs, 500-pound bombs, and loaded them up and bombed them and strafed them.
那这场任务是还蛮成功的，就是说，如同计划的，他们制造了那个土石流，把日本人的坂口支队给淹了。淹了之后，然后霍克81A 再从空中下来扫射剩下的日军部队。
他把那个山炸垮了以后，整个山瘫下来，因为他单行道。 把山炸垮下以后，把整个山路迷了以后扫射，日本人结果为了那边死伤惨重，最后还是没有堵挡在怒江那边，没办法再继续前进。
After the 4-day battle, Chennault reported to Chiang that the only vehicles on the Burma Road were those fleeing back to Burma.
And that saved southern China, saved us. Saved India. I mean, it was an important place for combat.
所以我认为这个战斗从军心士气上来看，还是从实质上来看，都是有非常重大意义的。就他把中国的后方保护下来了。
The exhausted pilots and their maverick commander, with their limited supplies, homemade bombs, and worn-out aircraft, performed a miracle. The motley crew may never have saluted, but they fought like tigers. By mid-1942, the war had become one of attrition. The Flying Tigers regrouped at Chongqing to defend China's wartime capital. Chennault bluffed the Japanese with only 4 aircraft patrolling every day and 12 fake aircraft made of bamboo and paper on the airfield.
They made these planes look like our airplanes, but actually they were false airplanes. The Japanese would come in, probably strafe them, and to find out there was nothing but paper and wood, you know. Actually, it took time to do it, but the Chinese were innovators, you know, they could do anything.
They may have had to rely on paper tigers on the ground, but even in limited numbers, the Tigers were potent in the air. With an acute shortage of planes, Chennault changed his strategy. Now they would attack the Japanese planes while they were on the ground. From the end of 1941 to July 4th, 1942, the Flying Tigers were involved in more than 100 combat missions in Burma and China. With only a handful of planes, they are credited with having shot down 299 enemy aircraft. Their early victories made the volunteers famous. Hollywood even made a John Wayne movie about them. In China, they were heroes. AVG may have been short for America Volunteer Group, but for many Chinese, it simply meant America Very Good. Part of the AVG's success was the result of an early warning system. Chennault called it his bamboo radar. It enabled the Tigers to get their planes in the air before Japanese bombers arrived. This gave the P-40s the vital height advantage they needed. The alarm signal was a large black paper ball rising to the top of the airfield flagpole. When a second black ball rose, it meant that the enemy aircraft were 20 minutes away. A third black ball meant there were 10 minutes left. Lying in wait at high altitude gave the AVG a tactical advantage. They could use their great diving speed to swoop down on the invaders. The Flying Tigers were the most successful unit in the war against Japan. Yet their very success hastened the unit's demise.
The rumors get as far back as January and February that we were going to be, pulled back into the service. And nobody really knew for sure what was going to happen.
We began amongst all of us to talk about possible induction. What's going to happen to us, Here we are, the American Volunteer Group.
The American Army Air Force coveted the Flying Tigers' enviable combat record. And they coveted Chennault's ace pilots. With the American Air Force itself at last deploying in China, it didn't want any rival. The U.S. Army 23rd Fighter Group hoped to absorb the AVG. The U.S. military commanders hoped that the experienced Flying Tigers would rejoin the U.S. Air Force. It needed them.
The pilots who would replace the American Volunteer Group pilots were trained fighter pilots. They had not, for the most part, there were a few exceptions, they had not seen aerial combat. A significant group, but they needed to learn. They had a high target to reach for. They had to prove themselves to the other pilots that they were good enough to be Flying Tigers.
But old rivalries and ham-fisted negotiators sank the deal.
就是说，很多人就觉得心里不痛快。事实上，他们已经离开美国1年了，在中国也作战了7个月，吃不好喝不好，精神压力，他们需要休息。陈纳德说，如果当初他愿意给他们1个月的休息时间， 那些人都会很高兴的回来中国继续参加战斗。
Chennault's success made the American commanders uncomfortable. Orders came that the AVG was to be disbanded on Independence Day, the 4th of July, 1942. But they didn't go quietly. There was one more battle. The same day, 12 Japanese aircraft attempted to attack Hanyang Airfield. 4 Flying Tigers intercepted them. They shot down 6 of the Japanese planes. It was the AVG's last engagement. Later that day, the AVG officially ceased to exist. Upon disbandment, most Tigers returned home. A few answered Chennault's call to help the handover. John Peacock was the first pilot to get married in China. His bride was Emma Jane Foster, a nurse in the Flying Tigers. They were not supposed to get married. It wasn't on the contract, but in the unwritten words. However, Chennault was very fond of these 2 young people. He not only allowed their marriage, but also held their wedding in Kunming. Now it was time to go home. Peacock agreed to stay an additional 2 weeks to help the handover. He never made it home. He was just 24 when he was shot down, leaving a pregnant wife behind. The AVG started with 99 pilots. It lost 23 pilots in total, 4 in aerial battles, the rest to ground fire and training accidents. When they were disbanded, 25 were aces, credited with shooting down 5 or more enemy planes. Generalissimo and Madame Chiang Kai-shek held a farewell party for the AVG members at which they expressed their gratitude. From founding to disbandment, the AVG cost China $8 million. Chennault felt sorry for that and apologized to the finance minister, TV Sung. The finance minister replied, "It was the best investment ever. You are concerned about the cost. It is I who should feel ashamed." Upon disbandment, most of the Tigers returned to the U.S., where they rejoined their former units. Some stayed in China, where, with the China National Aviation Corporation, they started another perilous mission, flying the notorious hump route over the Himalayas. Chennault rejoined the U.S. Army Air Force and stayed in China. The U.S. Army Air Force and the China-America Combined Wing inherited the name and the insignia of the Flying Tigers and used them until the end of the war. They would carry forward the glory of the Flying Tigers in China's sky.
The 14th Air Force came in and they called the Flying Tigers. We said, no, the Flying Tigers is one, that was AVG. We're a separate group completely. We're civilians. We are not military, we are civilians. We're American Volunteer Group, and that's the difference of Flying Tigers.